lecture on the death drive will be a summary in many ways of some of the key ideas that we have encountered so far. I want to try and put them together and also start to prepare us for where we're headed. And where we're headed is the notion, the famous, sometimes celebrated notion that Lacan elaborates in his 7th seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. And this is the idea of being between the two deaths. It's a formulation he uses in respect of Antigone, and it's a formulation that we will also employ in thinking about a different example, a cinematic example. We're going to give the example of the Steve McQueen film, Papillon, which recounts the traumatic and difficult experiences of Henri Charrière, the guy who's called Papillon, who is imprisoned on Devil's Island and various other places in French Guiana for lengthy periods. And in this story too, I think we can find something of this ethical predicament, this ethical situation of being located between the two deaths. But before we do that, we need to do a little bit of synthesizing work. And what I'd like to do to kick us off is to give us a quote from Alenka Zupancic's book, What is Sex? Just a few lines, but I think it'll help illuminate what I'm talking about here in this, the 6th installment of lectures on the death drive that I've entitled Two Forms of Life, Two Forms of Death. So here is Alenka. She says, she's talking about Deleuze and Lacan, both of whom, she says, elaborate notions of the death drive. What they both suggest, she says, is that the death drive cannot be thought in terms of a simple opposition between life and death, because it is precisely what belies this opposition and reconfigures it in the first place. So this is our theme today. We're going to ask how the Lacanian idea of the death drive complicates any simple, straightforward distinction between life and death, but rather, as it were, splits each of those two categories of understanding, and in a sense, complicates them and destabilizes them. So, we're not then dealing with a simple opposition between life and death, but a split in terms of each of them. So here's my very rudimentary schematic division. We've got death, where we can obviously think of actual physical death. Maybe you could say in Lacanian terms, this will be death in the real, but we can also think about death via the symbolic. Now, many of these terms we've already utilized, but I'm trying to bring them together in a kind of synthesizing way. Similarly, when we're talking about life, we could say, well, you got the actual physical stuff of existing life. Maybe this is life in the real, so to speak. But we also, as we've seen now in repeated excursions, life understood in the terms of an excess of life. Life as the surplus vitality of libidinal animation. And I was particularly inspired by a passage in Slavoj Žižek where he says, what the death drive enables us to understand is that you can have these paradoxical states of being dead while alive, and by this, dead while alive, he's referring to the processes of symbolic mortification, the symbolic overwriting of unmediated organic life or vitality. And we can also think about being alive while dead. And it's here where the notion of lamella comes in, excessive libidinal substance, excessive libidinal agitation, libido in its lethal overcoming of the limits to life. So let's try and speak a little bit about both of these things. And one of the references to Lacan that I'd like to make just very briefly is we'll look again at the Écrit, and we're going to take a brief quote from The Situation of Psychoanalysis and the Training of Psychoanalysts in 1956. Just a few lines from Lacan. He says, man is, prior to his birth and beyond his death, caught up in the symbolic chain. Man is, prior to his birth and beyond his death, caught up in the symbolic chain. Now, I like that for a number of reasons. One is because this idea that the symbolic chain both predates and antedates an organic life, it starts to, once again, problematize the parameters through which we normally think about organic life. What also stems from this sounds like a paraphrase from Žižek as well, is that the incessance of the symbolic chain, which has momentum, we've seen this many times, which continues, which through its operations of metaphoric displacement and metonymic displacement and metaphoric substitution has this chain effect of ongoing production of signifiers. The idea here is that this symbolic chain can fundamentally overdetermine and overwrite the stuff of everyday human experience. And moreover, the automatism of this chain, once it's in production, always troubles the homeostasis of human experience. This is a kind of Zizek paraphrase that he's trying to pull out something that Lacan is talking about. I've emphasized before as well that the symbolic order has this machinic quality, certainly for Lacan of Seminar 2, this machinic ongoing insistence. So with all of these ideas then, we get the idea that the symbolic is constantly, Adrian Johnston uses this phrase, cadaverizing the human subject, or as we've been putting it, the symbolic mortification of human experience. Now let's just pull out 2 quick moments recapitulating some of what we've said before. We have already noted this idea that the word may be seen as the death of the thing, the signifier overwriting the immediacy of experience, this kind of Hegelian reference point in the earlier Lacan. We could ask some questions about that, because while thematically it certainly is true that we can talk about a symbolic overwriting of life, the symbolic overwriting of an unmediated organic life, that is true, but of course then again within the Lacanian world, the idea that you may ever have some kind of unmediated access to pure life is troubled because there's always the signifier, okay? Moreover, what then starts to happen within Lacan, we don't just get this idea of the symbolic as overwriting life, the symbolic as producing forms of death. We also see this idea in, we've already noted the idea of repetition automatism, but in a simple clinical little tangent here, we could say that isn't the dilemma of the obsessional primarily that they mortify their own lives, rather than the possibility of something unpredictable about desire opening up and forcing them to live something of vitality. There is the orchestration of life, the preparation of life, the overwriting of life with an attempted form of structure, or maybe repetition. So we have these ideas about how the signifier overwrites experience. And we get some colorful ideas here also, the idea that the symbolic can be seen as a kind of colonizing parasite. But as Lacan moves on, there seems to be something of a move from this idea to a slightly different order of idea. So having given you a quote from Lacan in 1956, let's now give a quote that Lacan offers in the 7th seminar, Ethics of Psychoanalysis, where Lacan starts to also think about not just the overwriting of experience, and again it's a theme we've already touched on, but how the symbolic enables a certain totalization and thereby also an idea of a second death. And just to give you a suggestion of where we're going with this, you could say quite straightforwardly that the symbolic enables history, or a certain order of history, written, recorded history. But what that also means then is that the symbolic, in as much as it entails a function of negation, means that you can have a second order of obliteration, that the entirety of what is enabled via symbolic processes can be conceptualized as an everything, and that can also be, at least there could be an attempted erasure of everything. So this is page 212 in the English translation of Seminar 7. Lacan says, if everything that is immanent or implicit in the chain of natural events, if everything may be considered subject to the so-called death drive, it's only because there is a signifying chain. So again, I mean, it's a consistent point of repetition and emphasis in Lacan, the death drive within Lacan's own theory, you could say, this emphatic insistence on that the symbolic order itself enables a higher order of death. There's a nice kind of Lacanian moment here where you could say that death itself is not nearly as deathly as the symbolic is in the symbolic's capacity to bring around negations and so on and so forth. So what we're moving to here is that the symbolic enables a second order of death. And I mentioned that we were going to move towards this idea of being between the two deaths. And here's a nice way to try and make that point. Give an example, which is sometimes overly elaborated, but nevertheless, let's use the example. The Marquis de Sade and Danny Nobis makes reference to this in his really excellent text, The Law of Desire, which is an extended and detailed reading, in fact, perhaps the only one of its kind, of Lacan's Kant with Sade. It's an excellent reading of that text. And he makes mention of this, but we see it in other moments in Lacan as well. This idea that with the Marquis de Sade, when the Marquis de Sade died, in his last will and testament, there's this idea that he would like to be buried without any marking, to be buried in a place that had no tombstone, no marking, where nature would grow over, and all marks and traces of his existence would be eviscerated. There would be no more traces of his existence. Now, of course, maybe you want to take that with a pinch of salt, given that he wrote so much, which of course will give him an ongoing symbolic life. But all we're trying to get here is this sense of how the symbolic enables a second order of death, a more complete order of death. Back to the Marquis de Sade, even if that's not strictly true, can we imagine what it would be like that when one dies, that one has the hope at least, that every object that one had ever had, every little piece of evidence that one had lived would be erased. There would be no symbolic marks whatsoever of my existence. And I think in today's world, where there's so many traces, electronic, identity, online, traces of one's existence, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine that. But this second order of death, a second death where one dies not only within the remit of organic life, but also within the broader symbolic realm. This is an intriguing idea, and one that Lacan, I think, is moving towards. And again, the idea would be that it's only via the symbolic that you could have this second order, more complete level of absolute death. You can put it in those terms. Let's just anchor that with one brief clinical anecdote, just because the idea might sound overly abstract. It is, of course, true that Freud states at some point that it's only in melancholia that we witness, what does he call it, the total culture, or the complete culture of the death drive, something like this. And that may sound like a kind of disconnected comment, but I have read a case where a colleague who was working with a melancholic subject remembers the subject, the analysand, saying, it's not just that I wish I was dead. And this was a constant motif throughout the clinical work, ongoing imaginings, wishings, suicidal reveries, so on and so forth. It's not just that I wish I was dead. I honestly wish I could die. But I wish that I could die having never have existed at all. So that fuller sense of an erasure of existence in any historical marking, so on and so forth, that sounds like a symbolic order of death. Also, just while we're on that topic, if one thinks about the melancholic situation, and I mean that not in a clinical sense, in the desperate sadness and poignancy of these situations where cultures are completely eviscerated from history, this sounds like a second order of death, a symbolic death, where languages that were once spoken are no longer spoken by anyone, and where it's no longer possible to piece together anything of that culture, or very little of it, when it's precisely not, as it were, located in history, but consigned to a non-history. That, I think, is partly what we're talking about when we're having this idea of the death that can be enabled via the symbolic. So let's quickly just circle back to this side. This, what we've just been discussing, this idea of symbolic mortification, speaks to, particularly in this nice idea of the obsessional mortifier's life, of a kind of deathliness while being in a state of life. But on this side of the board, and this is also what we were speaking about in our previous talk, we have this idea of life in excess of life, a surplus vitality, libidinal animation. I'll give you one example of this. My wife and I were talking about the Lacanian idea of lamella, this mythical idea that Lacan comes up with to try to give I suppose, precisely a myth to libido. Libido is not a Freudian concept he's particularly happy with. He doesn't like the organic overtones of it. So he tries to convey it in a purely mythical form, and he gives us this amoeba-like, flat egg-like substance of pure life that he imagines that might fall over one's face, and one has this kind of lethal experience of the life that constantly reproduces itself, being lethal all along the way. And I remember right at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, someone sent me a text and they said something like, imagine this virus that comes on your face and it stops you from breathing. And I just remember thinking, golly, it sounds a little bit like Lacan's lamella in some ways. Maybe it's a faulty comparison, but the idea of a virus which can persist beyond generations of human existence, the idea that we might be able to locate a virus that has existed since the time of Alexander the Great or something, that keeps on, that has this lethal insistence on life beyond life, consuming life on its way to continue to exist and proliferate, sounds a little bit thematically like what we're talking about here. An excessive libidinal substance that is drive in its purest form, and that entails a certain type of lethality as a very means of its existence. So now that we have these two, being dead while alive and having a kind of deathliness, even having a kind of aliveness while being dead on this side, we can start to then get a sense of how we might piece together some of these ideas in a kind of pseudo-ontological conceptualization. We could say then, and again I'm remembering something, a formulation from Zizek, that organic life in humans is always subject to symbolic mortification, the intervention of the symbolic, the intervention of the signifier. And in just the same way, biological vitality is always subject to the lethal excesses of the drive. So death drive itself does not have a clear ontological status, and we know this. Lacan is famously resistant to any ontological formulations. Death drive does not itself have an ontological status, but it's rather the result of the ontological completeness of life and death itself. And this is one way of thinking how this concept, this, as it were, impossible to grasp understanding that is so crucial to psychoanalysis, troubles and problematizes our basic ideas of life and death. In other words, to reiterate the idea once again, it's not that it has an ontological status, but that it destabilizes the apparent separation of life and death, and also it complicates and shows up the ontological completeness of life and death themselves. Just one last comment then. You may have noticed that in each of these, we have this idea that the symbolic might overwrite, cadaverize some kind of spontaneous organic existence. But inasmuch as the symbolic has this mortifying aspect, even as it does that, it mortifies life, it brings with it the possibility of a type of ongoing immortality, a symbolic existence. In some respects, you could say in today's world, it's quite difficult to fundamentally achieve a second order of death, because there's so many markers, symbolic traces of having exist, certainly in the so-called whatever first world. But nevertheless, it's almost like there's a Mobius strip here, where although the symbolic mortifies life, it also mortifies life in a way that enables a certain existence to continue. And one wonders, here, do we not see a similar kind of Mobius strip, that we have a state of being alive, although being alive while animated with this, as it were, unholy libidinal agitation of jouissance, of libido. We're alive while being possessed by a kind of lethal impetus, a lethal drive impetus to go on and on and on, despite that it may kill us. That again, we've got this alive while dead, but the very deathliness of this lethal animation of drive also pushes us on and on and on. So it sounds like here there's also a Mobius strip where the lethal deathliness that invests life also goes on to give it a second form of life.